What's up guys, Asian here again with another PTS video, and today we're going to be going over the latest patch notes 5.2.3. There are going to be this is actually quite a long patch notes, mainly because of the fact that they did make a lot of changes to damage over time abilities that they mentioned in 5.2.2. So a lot of the changes you're going to be seeing today are mostly just going to be, we buffed this ability by X% in order to kind of conform to their latest standards for abilities here. But there are a couple of things here that are not just straight buffs that I did want to mention here and discuss a little bit in depth about. So moving along ahead here in terms of new features, Mid-Year Mayhem, it looks like they are going to try to bring it back. You guys remember last Mid-Year Mayhem was canceled just because the servers were actually not good enough to sustain the population that they were anticipating for Mid-Year Mayhem. But hopefully with the new changes they've been making with the game code, they'll be able to finally be able to have Mid-Year Mayhem this year. So fingers crossed for that moving forward. Murkmire Celebration. The one thing with Murkmire is that it's not a very lucrative zone to farm for. None of the sets there are particularly strong. There are double drops, so Blackroad's Prison, for example, might be worth running through if you are a healer that still needs the Restoration Staff from Blackroad's Prison. Pretty decent staff, situationally useful, of course, like many sort of sets that healers run, but in those situations, it's going to be very, very powerful. For those of you guys who intend on progressing Sunspire hard mode, for example, you will want to have this staff on hand when you do Lakessi's hard mode in order to combat the healing debuff that's placed on anybody who's going through the ice prisons. So, Murkmire Celebration, again, Overland, not so much, but for those of you guys who still need the Black Rose Prison staff, pretty good opportunity to try to get that there. Just some template information here. Dragonhold. Not really concerned about Dragonhold because this is mostly just a questing zone. No real changes to PV, any sort of PvE stuff in here. Unless there's a change to any sets here, but I don't see any sets at all. Yeah, nothing here. Under Elsewhere, Necromancer is still going to be kept under the Elsewhere patch notes because it's still not considered base game until the next chapter is released, most likely. Here, a lot of the stuff here is just buffs to damage over time components. So Boneyard was buffed, Shocking Siphon was buffed, Skeletal Mage was buffed. Three passes were buffed. So Rapid Rot, which increases the damage bonus to all damage over time builders, was buffed by 50%. So it increases damage bonus by 15%. Usable parts, the cost reduction was basically doubled, 25 to 50 compared to 12 to 25, and then Disdain Harm under the Bone Tyrant line, which reduces damage from damage over time components. That was also buffed to 15% as well. But the big change here is under the major vulnerability that you get from Frozen Colossus and its morph. It now lasts for 8 seconds after dealing any damage, rather than 3 seconds after the final smash. So currently on the Alive server, that is Scalebreaker, it applies for, I believe, 5 seconds after every single hit. So it essentially is about a 6-second duration, basically. Now, Major Vulnerability now lasts 8 seconds, and enemies hit by Major Vulnerability cannot be affected again for 20 seconds after it applies. And this is to prevent situations where this debuff could be kept up indefinitely by rotating an army of necromancers. Now, if we really quickly look at the wording, it says it cannot be affected again for 20 seconds after it applies. So if it is applied right away, this implies that it's going to be 8 seconds up, 12 seconds down. This ends up being about a 40% uptime. Now, Frozen Colossus costs 225 ultimate. If we assume that you're not getting any sort of additional ultimate generation, you have a base ultimate generation of 3 seconds. So if you divide 225 by 3, you will find that a Necromancer, just using this base ulti generation, there are obviously ways you can bump that up, minor heroism potions, for example, necrotic potency. But just using the base, a Necromancer will be able to get their ultimate up every 75 seconds. On a 20-second cooldown, you just divide that 75 seconds by 20, and you get, if you round up, 4 Necromancers. So that is going to be the amount that you need, minimum, in order to maintain the maximum 40% uptime on Major Vulnerability. 3 Necromancers, you're not going to be able to hit the uptime, and obviously 2 and 1, you won't be able to hit that uptime either. So you'll need at least 4 Necromancers in order to maintain that maximum uptime. What this means for raid compositions, it might end up being that you're going to shift from 8 stamina necromancers to 4 stamina necromancers, a stam DK or a DK tank for the minor brutality, somewhere you have a nightblade for the minor savagery, and then the other DPS slots are probably going to be filled out with potentially stam sorks, which are proving to be very powerful in this coming patch, not just because of the changes to bound armaments as well as the clan fear, but also to a secondary change we'll talk about in a little bit here. But it remains to be seen. We might still see 8 stamina necromancers depending on how things play out. So that 20-second cooldown is essentially the off-balance treatment. So this will impact potentially raid DPS configurations. In general, this is going to be a buff for any group that has less than 4 necromancers. This might end up being a nerf for any group that runs more than 4 necromancers as their DPS specs. Under the combat and gameplay, so this line here is just saying that they increased all the dot abilities. Not much to see here. So we're going to be skipping over a lot of these. So just because it's basically just we increased the damage. So Fiery Breath was buffed, Searing Strike was buffed, Searing Heat now applies to the DK standard. It wasn't on the PTS. It still does on live, but it didn't on the PTS. It just fixed that a little bit. So mag DKs and stam DKs, I should be able to get a more accurate test now. Fixed a couple issues with Molten Armament, buff to Lotus Fan, buff to Twisting Path, Shadow Image, the teleport range now 28 meters. This is going to impact PvP. I know this was a pain point for PvP players when they reduced it down to 22 meters. So hopefully that will kind of alleviate your concerns that way, anybody who plays Nightblade mains in PvP. Failed Strike, they reduced the cost of the ability. They buffed Cripple. Ball of Lightning no longer stuns at its end location for Sorks. Still retains a new addition of Snare and Immobilize immunity. Streak continues to stun at the end location and behind you after ending. They buffed Lightning Splash, they buffed Bound Armaments, they buffed Unstable Familiar and all of its morphs, so the Volatile Familiar as well as the Clan Fear. And they buffed Winged Twilight, so pets are going to be stronger for Sorks, so this is going to be a buff to Mag Sorks and Stam Sorks. Right now it does seem like Mag Sorks are probably going to be the strongest Magicka DPS setup right now. Still remains to be seen, still have to do a couple of testing, but it does seem like Mag Sorks are going to be very strong moving forward into Dragonhold, assuming no other changes come in 5.2.4 and 5.2.5 when they finally release the update. For Templars, they reduced the cost of Luminous Shards. They buffed Spear Shards and its morphs. They also buffed Blazing Spear by a little bit more as well. They buffed Sunspire, they buffed Solar Barrage, and now Ritual Retribution now deals damage equal to the healing coefficient. Not sure if that's a buff or a nerf. I don't really know this off the top of my head. But it is a change nonetheless. Under Warden, Dive now sets enemies off balance when you're 7 meters away rather than 12 meters. They increased the bleed on cutting Dive that more. They buffed Swarm. They buffed Impaling Shard, or I should say they buffed Winter's Revenge, and they also reduced the cost of Impaling Shards by a pretty hefty amount, about just under 1200 cost. So pretty hefty buff to the sustain there for Impaling Shards. Buffed Cleave. They buffed the damage over time component for Stampede. They buffed Blade Cloak and its morphs. They buffed Twin Slashes. They also buffed the heal for Blood Craze by the exact same proportion. For Bow, they buffed Poison Arrow and Poison Injection now applies the execute bonus to the whole ability rather than just damage over time component, so another extra buff to Poison Injection there. Buff to Volley, buff to Destructive Touch and Destructive Reach, buff to Wall of Elements, buff to Soul Trap, buff to Infectious Claws, buff to the Bleed from Werewolf Berserker, buff to Trap Beast, buff to Entropy, buff to Scalding Rune. So again, a lot of buffs across the board for damage over time components. It does seem like they're going to be sticking with this, so I will be able to test out DPS rotations now and overall DPS numbers on the PTS. So anticipate videos taking a look at that. Just kind of very generic, where do the classes stand in relation to each other kind of videos. Not really any sort of specific build videos until the update is released on live server. Now, another interesting thing here are going to be the item sets that were buffed. So a few item sets that were related to damage over time components were buffed. So Blood Drinker, which increases damage bonus for bleed abilities, was buffed to 33%. Still not going to make it very powerful, just because bleed is not a very common source of damage. It's basically just the weapon passes for two-handed and dual wield, and then carve and twin slashes. Couple of sets do bleed damage, but they're generally speaking very weak compared to other sets for PvE. Might be nice for PvP, but I don't really PvP enough to really know whether or not Blood Drinker is going to be useful at all. And then Deadly Strike, where they increase the damage bonus from this set to 20% up from 14%, essentially a 50% buff. Deadly Strike is a set that increases the damage for all damage over time abilities that deal, I believe, physical, poison, disease, basically any sort of stamina based dot is buffed by Deadly Strike. This is a huge buff to the set, so much so that I believe it is going to be the strongest set, if not one of the strongest sets, to use when you don't need to use Reliquant. So for example, trash pulls or fights where you have to switch targets very frequently. Reliquant's not going to be very powerful in those situations, and so Deadly Strike might end up being the best set there. You combine that with Slakestes, and you will have a very powerful setup there for trash pulls. It remains to be seen whether it is going to be the strongest set, but based on this and how strong certain classes are with dots, for example Stamslurks, I do see this being a very powerful set. There's a medium armor set from Cyrodiil, so you can buy it off of guild traders. You can gamble it. I believe it's from Bruma. You can try to buy it from Bruma using your AP, but it is a fairly common set. It's a very old set at this point, so it should be fairly cheap to obtain, although prices might end up going up because of this patch here. So definitely try to grab those set pieces now rather than later. But definitely a set that I'd recommend picking up, especially for Stamslurks. Stamslurks, a lot of your damage is basically damage over time components. So being able to basically buff pretty much all your damage with 20% is really huge, but it should be a good set for all stamina DPS. But that is pretty much it for all of the damage sort of PvE components. Obviously there's going to be a bunch of different bug fixes and things like that, some things possibly related to housing and stuff, but we're really focused on more PvE, raid, endgame PvE balance changes. So that concludes this video. As always, link in the description below to the full patch notes so you guys can take that at your own perusal. PvP players, please let me know if I got my sort of assumptions about the changes to these PvP oriented abilities and sets correct, and also just to help out anybody else who might be PvPing, just because I don't PvP enough to really know how these changes impact PvP too much. And yeah, that's going to be it. So expect some videos now taking a look at first Deadly Strike, how it compares to other possibly replacement sets for Reliquant, as well as a general sort of taking a look at where the different DPS classes stand and kind of where DPS meta might shift. I also am working on a video taking a look at the healer meta and how that's going to shift based on a couple of changes that have been made since 5.2.0 came out. Hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you guys in the next dungeon.